Hello everybody! This week we're asking ourselves, how the hell can anyone still be a socialist nowadays? We know so many bad things that happen under socialist governments, so why do some people still want socialism? That's what I will answer today. But first, I think I will disclose the purpose of this video, right after you subscribe and donate on Patreon. Go on, I'm waiting. My goal with this video here is to honestly engage with questions about why people still believe in socialism, and I want to give honest answers. Oftentimes these arguments are used by trolls to waste time, which works well because each one of these questions has a long and complicated answer, perfect for trolling. But this video is instead directed at genuinely curious people who actually wonder how you can support the same ideology as Stalin. This video is also intended to be shared with people like that. If you have an uncle or sibling who genuinely wonders about what modern socialists think about gulags, then you can direct them here at the appropriate timestamp. The timestamps are both in the description and in the YouTube chapter thing. Full disclosure, I am a socialist. My goal with this video is to explain what socialists believe, and ultimately, I hope that giving people an understanding will make them socialists. Which I do because I genuinely believe that a socialist world would be better than the current one. Yes, I am biased in making this video, but everyone is biased, the only difference is I'm saying so up front. There is one more thing we need to discuss before we can get into the questions, and that is the moral framework I'm using. I am a utilitarian. This means I consider the good of the many more important than the good of the few. I see this as the logical extension of democracy, ruled by the majority, not minority. Because of this, I am totally on the side of removing monarchs as absolutist rulers, for example. Because establishing democracy liberates everyone besides the monarch. So later, I will talk about one person exploiting others, and I will just take it as given that that is a bad thing. If you don't consider exploitation to be bad, you will have a hard time understanding my points. But I don't think there are many people like that here. Without further ado, let's get into the questions. Naturally, to start discussing what socialism is all about, we need to define the current system, usually called capitalism. Depending on who says it, that word can mean anything. Conservatives and libertarians use it to mean everything good, and socialists use it to mean pretty much everything bad. For the purposes of this video, we will use the textbook definition of capitalism, and that is a system of production, aka a way to structure the economy, in which the industry and land are owned by private individuals. This means you can buy land and live on it. You can form a business and hire people, and you're entitled to the profit the business makes. All that is capitalism. Competition, on the other hand, is not a feature of capitalism per se, but one of markets. Nowadays, the free market and capitalism are often used interchangeably. I like being a pedant about the difference, but even I conflate them occasionally. Essentially, capitalism is a way production is organized, and the market then takes those products and distributes them. It does this via traders. They buy products from the factory and sell them in stores. Then, depending on how many customers buy the products, they sell more of those, increasing the demand, which can cause businesses to produce more or increase the price. Supply and demand, as well as competition, are market topics. Now that we know what market capitalism is, we can get into what socialism means. Socialism, if you boil it down to its definition, is just an economy in which the industry is owned by the community instead of an individual. So instead of a factory being controlled by one individual and all the profit going to that person, it's owned and controlled by a group of people, which then decides what to do with the profit. Socialism is a bit like Christianity. It looks like one movement, but once you look closer, it's actually extremely fractured and 90% infighting. For most of this video, I will keep things vague and explain the positions of different types of socialists. Because of this, I'm not explaining one specific form of socialism. So different points may appear contradictory. This is because socialism is such a huge movement with many contradictory goals and opinions. At the end of the video, I will explain one reasonable possible form of socialism, just to give you one exact vision. The reason socialism varies so much is that so many things can be interpreted differently. Like here, community. What does that mean? Well, some say it means a factory should be run by its own workers, democratically. This is called a worker co-op. Others say that the entire surrounding area should have a say. After all, they are affected by pollution as well. And yet other socialists say that the factory should be run by the state, under the condition that the state genuinely represents the community as a whole, which yet again can be defined in very different ways. And then, of course, socialism is just a way to structure the industry, not distribution. And this is another source of infighting. Some want socialism to keep a market. This would mean the factories would be run by the community, but they would still compete for customers. Others, yet again, want all production and prices to be planned by a central mega-government, like they did in the USSR. And some want to plan the economy, but in a decentralized way. So every city or district would report how much of each product it needs and communicate that to the factories. There's also an AI-planned economy in which you hope that a super intelligent AI doesn't fuck us over. I have specialized videos on how these would work exactly in my Ideology Explained playlist. You may be scratching your head right now. I used the dictionary definition to define socialism, as most socialists do. But you may have heard completely different stories. The most common assumptions are that socialism means something like the USSR, or that socialism is what Bernie Sanders talks about. More about Sanders in a minute. It makes sense that if you hear socialism, you look at history, or even just your memory of back then, and see what socialism meant at that point. And that was Soviet socialism, meaning all industry and trade are owned by the state. And if that is how you define socialism, then you are bound to think that socialism means the government taking control over the industry and people. Unhelpfully, this isn't what most modern-day socialists mean anymore. Yes, in the 70s, you could say a good majority of socialists thought that a large state is socialism, but this has since changed. A lot of modern socialists are anarchists, who don't want a central government at all. Instead, they want only local communes. I have a video on that as well. The idea that socialism is whenever the government does things is very deeply rooted in many people's heads. If you look at the Young Turks, they tell you that the police and firefighters are socialist. So you could say that people who aren't socialists themselves are the ones who think socialism is about giving the government more power, while modern-day socialists themselves just think socialism is community control over the means of production, which, see above, there are many ways to do that. But what about Bernie Sanders? He calls himself socialist, right? Yes, he does, and frankly, I have no idea why. By European standards, we would call him a social democrat. That is someone who wants to keep the capitalist free market, but with strong social support nets by the state. Social democrats recognize that the market is great at expanding an economy, but not great at providing for the poor. So they want to use the state to correct for these issues of capitalism, via government healthcare and minimum wages and such. This is exactly the state of the Nordic countries. They are capitalist free market economies with a strong state. They wouldn't call themselves socialists, but rather social democrats. Of course, they have a rather strong state for US standards, which ties back to people's thinking that the government makes a place socialist. Again, this is something socialists like myself disagree with. It's about whether individuals or the community own the industry. And in the Nordic countries and under Bernie Sanders' proposed future, the economy belongs to private individuals. That is how I distinguish between people who call themselves socialist for popularity and people who are actual anti-capitalist activists. How do they want the economy structured? A common thing people do is look at our modern democratic, capitalist first world nations and compare them to the Eastern Bloc of the Cold War. I'm not gonna lie, the Eastern Bloc loses that comparison. Yes, they had workers in charge of the factories, and the profit they made was given to the state, which then invested it back in the economy, usually. But they were all practically dictatorships, which didn't let people leave to the West and sometimes used the military and police to crack down on protests. The Prague Spring and Tiananmen Square come to mind. I'm not going to try to make excuses for these countries. They had good and bad sides, and the Cold War is too complex for this video. So instead, I'll just give you the good news that practically no modern day socialist wants a repeat of the USSR under Stalin. I had a poll among my viewers, who are mostly leftists, and only 3% of the people said the USSR was all good. Most are somewhere in between. Everyone but the most hardcore authoritarian leftist agrees that gulags and the death penalty are bad and shouldn't be part of future attempts at socialism. A common question is, how can you like socialism if the Eastern Bloc was so much poorer than the West? The obvious answer is that most modern socialists have looked at the Eastern Blocs and learned from it. So it's very unlikely that we would make the same mistakes again. We know why the East was poorer. See, the West got financial support from the USA, while the East had to rely on the USSR, which had lost 27 million people and most of its industry to the Nazi invasion a few years earlier. So, at the start of the Cold War, the East already had a disadvantage. And as time went on, the parties became more corrupt and the politicians became content. They built the economy in a way to provide enough for everyone, but not more. They decided that everyone could drive the same model of car, which is true, but because of that they didn't improve it with time. And businesses in the East didn't try to make as much money and as many products as possible. Instead, they made just enough profit to cover their expenses and not more. And if a business made a loss, then the government would subsidize it, because paying to keep a business alive was cheaper and more humane than letting the workers from there be unemployed. The Eastern Bloc had no unemployment for decades on end. Personally, I believe that outweighs the downsides of not having every company be 110% profitable, but we could disagree about this. So, the East was poorer for a combination of reasons: worse starting conditions and inflexible, centrally planned state socialist economies would be the main ones. And of course, socialists fall into two groups: the ones that don't want an economy like that at all, and those who want an economy like that but updated to fix the flaws. My point is, socialists don't look at the Berlin Wall and think, damn, I wish I lived in a state that would shoot me for trying to leave. Instead, we learn from the past to not repeat its mistakes, which is our secret plan to destroy capitalism. Because, for some reason, capitalism refuses to learn from its own economic crises. But we do. One of the most common anti-communist talking points is that communism killed X million people, which is bad faith at best. I don't want to dwell on this for too long. I already have an entire video going into this very question. To sum it up, all these deaths happened under socialist regimes, but the numbers have been inflated a lot, and barely any of them can actually be blamed on socialism itself. Rather, it should be blamed on the governments of Stalin and Mao. And see above, pretty much all leftists think that Stalin and Mao made mistakes. Whether these mistakes outweigh the benefits they brought to the world, like destroying Nazi Germany and transforming the country from a feudal backwater into a superpower, depends on which leftist you're talking to. But 97% of leftists think that things like gulags and mass killings of landlords were bad and shouldn't be repeated. So, did Stalin and Mao single-handedly kill millions? Kinda, depends on how you define that, but even so, nobody thinks this was a good thing, so nobody will work to repeat it. Many wonder, why are you a socialist? Capitalism won the Cold War, right? Doesn't that make it a better system? And the obvious answer is that just because it won, it doesn't make the capitalist system better. And if you look into the details of why the USSR collapsed, you have a hard time blaming socialism for that. I have a video on that. But this question, yet again, misunderstands the goals of modern socialists. Again, neither me nor anyone I know wants to replicate Soviet socialism step by step. What we want to do is to build a society in which people are more in control of their lives. And for this, we use the old socialist countries as examples to learn from. Not ideal utopias to copy, but flawed attempts which we can study. Now, I talked a lot about how barely anyone intends to rebuild the Soviet Union. But how do we know it won't turn out like that again? After all, Lenin and Mao probably didn't envision these countries turning out like that. So how can we be sure not to make the same mistakes they made? Well, I think the main answer is that we live in wildly different conditions. Russia in 1917 was basically a third world nation, with almost everyone in poverty and huge social unrest. Same for China in the Civil War. Because of this, the revolutionaries somehow had to set up the economy in a way in which to produce and distribute products en masse, which led to a centralized bureaucracy, which completely controlled every aspect of the economy. But nowadays, people have these products already. We don't need a nationwide system to produce and transport shoes. People already have shoes. So we don't need to set up a strong socialist government to do that job. Life nowadays is completely different to life in the Russian Empire in 1917. And because of that, the socialism which we would establish nowadays would be wildly different to the Soviet one. The same is true for secret police and army. The USSR and the Chinese People's Republic were all formed in civil wars, which made the government centralize power and crack down on perceived enemies like Tiananmen Square or the Prague Spring. Naturally, this means that modern-day socialism is in no way predetermined to be a repeat of the USSR, but rather a system that learned from the USSR's failures. A common question, perhaps the most common question I got when talking about socialism to people in real life was, why aren't you just happy with what you have? You are so much better off than 99.999 of humanity throughout history. And the answer is that there are two main reasons I prefer a socialist economy over a capitalist one. For one, having a business be controlled by one person means all employees have no control over their lives while at their job. Like, we pretend to live in democracies, but we spend most of our lives in workplaces with strict authoritarian hierarchies. I believe if workers held a democratic control over a business, they would be happier and freer, in addition to doing things like distributing the income more equitably. And of course, in that case, every employee has a stake in the business, increasing their motivation. The second reason I don't like capitalism is that in a capitalist business or factory, profit is generated by the workers. In a factory, you need all workers and machines to work in harmony for the business to make money. But who gets the profit? The business owner and the investors. There is a mathematical way to prove that workers are being stolen from, but it's complicated, so watch the linked video. And this is where I get back to the question. For example, I will say that I'm paid only half of what I should be, considering the amount of time I worked. And as a reply, I will get that I should be grateful to even have a job and access to all these modern consumer products given to us by capitalism. And also I have the best quality of life in history. And my reply is, I am. I am genuinely grateful for all the advances capitalism has made. But just because it did good doesn't mean it's the perfect system, does it? I believe we can build a system that retains all of the luxury of the current capitalist system and give the workers control over their businesses. Capitalism may be the best system established so far, perhaps even better than the Soviet socialism was. But it's not perfect, and we can do better. A very common assumption is that socialists are just 20-year-old political science students who want free stuff. The logic is that socialists want to redistribute wealth. See, basically, because business owners like Jeff Bezos make their money by exploiting people, see above, I have a video explaining how, some socialists want to take this money, which he gained illegitimately, and use it for those in need. Note that not all socialists even want wealth redistribution, and even fewer think that they themselves should get part of that wealth. You may have noticed that I was talking about socialism for a good 20 minutes, and didn't once mention redistributing wealth. This is because socialism is about changing the way the economy is run, not some minor policy changes. I would even dare to say that wealth redistribution is more of a social democratic topic, something Bernie Sanders argues for, not a core part of socialism. Another common objection I get is that if workers genuinely democratically controlled their workplace, what would stop them from working less and taking more breaks? Nothing. And I think that's a good thing, because it means that workers are less stressed at work, increasing their happiness. And of course, workers are smart enough to understand that working too little will cause the business to collapse. So maybe they would work less and the profit would be reduced, but before the business would actually fail, they would work overtime. We know this because that's what happened in Yugoslavia, where all businesses were run by the workers, as well as in co-ops like the Mondragon Corporation that exist right now. But there is, of course, a different origin to this argument, and that is based on Marx. He wrote, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need," which has been interpreted to mean that everyone is cared for, whether they work or not. Shockingly, no socialist country ever implemented this 100%, and I don't know a socialist party that seeks to do that. In all socialist countries, people had to work to make a living. Marx's quote was about a utopic future, not a practical goal for socialists to reach in our lifetimes. So people would still be forced to work by the fact that they need to eat something. Of course, practically all socialist nations had/will have unemployment benefits, but precedent shows that those don't stop people from working. Now comes the oldest question, which I answered on my channel, the topic of my very first video. Why would people bother to innovate if there is no free market to outcompete others on? Without profit incentive, why bother? And as you just learned, there is a video specifically on this on my channel already, so I will keep this brief. Essentially, innovation happens in two places: in publicly funded universities and research institutes, and in private laboratories paid for by corporations. Capitalists themselves, like Elon Musk, don't invent car parts on their own. Instead, they buy patents from universities and they pay people to research and innovate for them. And of course, just because we would remove Elon Musk as CEO of Tesla doesn't mean that Tesla, now run by workers, can't keep paying the researchers. But wait, I've not answered why these businesses would want to innovate if they couldn't sell more on an open market. Well, basically because they want to. Like the Wright brothers made almost nothing from their inventing the airplane. People innovate because they want to, not because of a profit drive. For some reason, my channel has an overrepresentation of scientists in my comment section, so feel free to discuss this with them. Another very common argument is that capitalism fits human nature better than socialism. Unfortunately, nobody ever really elaborates on what that means. Maybe that humans compete a lot and work hard to improve their lives? Both of that is perfectly possible in a socialist economy. As a matter of fact, in socialism, a worker would have an easier time improving their lives than a worker in a capitalist business, simply because the boss isn't around to take a cut. Of course, every single socialist system ever paid people more when they worked more. The idea that in socialism everyone gets the same thing no matter if they work a little or a lot seems to have been made up in the Cold War. Even in the USSR, and see above, most of us don't want a repeat of that, more work meant more pay, which meant better housing and more luxury products. And of course, nothing about socialism prevents you from competing with your neighbor over which one of you can have the most uselessly expensive car. The only thing socialism forbids is you forming a business and then taking profit other people generated. I talked about removing bosses and democratically running businesses a lot. And so far I left out the fact that these businesses are currently owned by someone. The capitalist argument is that taking the businesses from them and letting the workers take over would just punish those rich people for working hard. Of course, barely any of the super rich actually made their money themselves, like most inherited a significant part and the rest they made by underpaying workers. But for the sake of the argument, Let's assume they're genuinely self-made and their business was only successful due to them working extremely hard. Even if we assume all that, I still think that they shouldn't own that business going forward. Just because their power to control their business directly gives them a lot of power over the workers. They can make someone unemployed or close down the factory in one decision. It makes the lives of the workers an uncertain hell. Depending on what kind of socialist you are, there are 3 ways you can transition from a capitalist owning businesses to workers controlling the businesses. You can take the capitalists' business and their money and property, leaving them with nothing but their ability to work, which would mean they are workers now. You could take their business and hand it to the workers, but leave them with their money and other property. This way they could retire or at least stay on their standard of living until they find a way to make money without exploiting others. Or if you're really generous, you could use the state to buy the businesses and give them to the workers, either for free or you could lease it to them. The third of these options is of course the one you would go for if you're a reformist, since this way you don't even need to fight a civil war, assuming the capitalists consider the compensation fair. I spent a lot of time saying what socialism in the future would not look like. It won't be Stalinism, it won't be like the Eastern Bloc, it won't have such a big state, and so on. But what would it look like? Well, there are hundreds of answers to this. I will just give you one of many, my vision. The modern day state would be abolished. Most of its tasks would be taken over by a commune government. Depending on local conditions, a commune should have 10 to 100,000 inhabitants and be reasonably local. The commune would use a lot of participatory democracy to increase individual liberty. Communes could voluntarily join confederations that manage large-scale projects like highways, which fall outside of the commune's responsibility. Businesses and factories would be owned and operated by the people who work in them. If someone quit, they would lose their share of the business. If someone new was hired, they would also gain part of the ownership of the business. The profit made would only be used in whatever way the workers decide on, minus a cut for the commune so it can afford its services. New businesses could be started by individuals or groups, but the ownership would always lie with everyone working there, even if one person paid for it. The commune could of course also provide capital to form new businesses. There could be a market, or alternatively the communes could negotiate with the businesses to find the best products to be distributed to the people. This was all very quick and not very detailed. I just wanted to paint one picture to give you a specific example to consider. The same scenario with more detail exists as a separate video if you're interested. After I told you this, you might rightfully ask, then what country is socialist at all? After all, what I just described here has never been tried, and all socialisms that have been tried for more than a few years looked nothing like that. Why even call those the same thing? Well, the answer is that the scenario I outlined is a form of anarcho-communism, while the historically existing ones were authoritarian leftists. There are arguments for naming these anarchist ideas and the historical attempts at socialism different things. Many people envision a word like that would just call themselves anarchists to avoid being confused with the USSR and co., with whom they share barely any ideas. There are even those who say that the USSR, along with the other socialist states of the Cold War, weren't socialist at all. The argument goes that in the Soviet Union, the state owned the industry. In the USSR, the state was seen as representing the people, while an anarchist sees the state as separate to the people. So the state owning the industry is not socialism. As a matter of fact, the state just becomes a new capitalist, coining the term state capitalism. Personally, I see both sides of this, and I don't think calling the USSR not socialist will help anyone. Because denying that the USSR was an attempt at socialism just makes the left seem as like liars. Not real socialism has become a sort of meme, and not in a good way. Personally, I consider the USSR and the other socialist states of the Cold War to be actual genuine attempts at socialism, and I call them that. And despite my goals being separate to theirs, and me not wanting anything like those states, I still call myself socialist, because in forming my ideal world, I looked at the mistakes they made and learned from them. Now, the final question before this video is another 30 minutes long one. Getting tight. How the hell would you go from our familiar economic and social conditions to this new ideal of a better world? Well, there are two main approaches: reform and revolution. Both of them have up and downsides. The upside of reform is that it is legal and will lead to far less bloodshed, but it also often causes people to compromise on their ideas, as social democrats are infamous for. And there are some things a reformist party can never do, like reform a central government out of existence. The upside of a revolution is that you can pretty much throw out the entire state and economy and completely restructure them. The downsides are, of course, suffering, death, resistance, and possible arrest and execution for treason, and so on. I have an entire video on reform and revolutions, should you be interested in more details. So in conclusion, there's nothing to conclude. I just hope I was able to clear up some things. If you're one of my regular subscribers, I recommend saving this link somewhere so you can use it the next time someone asks you these questions. And while you're at it, donate on my Patreon and subscribe. Thanks for watching. And extra thanks to Darius the Bird, Eric Betts, Harris Hawk, Attila Nemes, Karis, Chairman Pineapple, Daniel Hyman, Daphne, Emily Marigold Klassen, Gabby Gita, Hardington Gurdington, Josh C, Klastrup, Nane Pema, Nora Quinn, Ollie, Pote, Raymond DeVille, Red Shock Trooper, Roman Bryant, Sean Murphy, Skylar Magnum Turner, Stairmaster Chef, and Trey.